The Western Women's Movement, presented by Jora Mariette V. Martinez, Christian Isaac Tamaro, and Ranjay Theodosio. Introduction. There have been many unprecedented women who have made significant contributions to local or global history. But not all of them have been advocates for women issues. The women's movement is made up of both men and women who work and fight for gender equality and the betterment of women as a social group. Women were traditionally confined to the home as daughters, wives, and mothers in most societies. And we are often only aware of women in history because of their relationship to famous men. Of course, many women have played important roles in cultural and political life throughout history, but they are often overlooked. Women were prevented from conducting business without a male representative, be it father, brother, husband, legal agent, or son. Married women could not exercise control over their own children without the permission of their husbands. Moreover, women had little or no access to education and were barred from most professions. Lesson objectives. The aim of Western movement of feminism are the following. Women should be able to own property and vote. Women should be treated equally and without discrimination. Women are being encouraged to question, reclaim, and redefine the ideas, words, and media that have been used to transmit ideas about womanhood, gender, beauty, sexuality, femininity, and masculinity.
What is feminism? When we say feminism, feminism is fundamentally the belief in full social, economic, and political equality for women. Feminism arose primarily in response to Western tradition that limited women's rights, but feminists too has global manifestation and variation. Western Women's Movement, a brief history. Discussing Western women's movement involves looking at what many feminist historians and theorists called as waves of feminism. Like any wave, there is distinct rise in the movement, its apex being the height of the issues surrounding the movement at a given time. Like a wave, there is also a decline in the involvement after the issue was resolved or if another more urgent issues arose. There are three distinct waves of feminism in the Western world, each associated to different schools of thought. The first wave of feminism involves the call for women's equal rights, focusing on the woman's right to the vote. The next wave is known as radical feminism, a post-World War II era of feminism when women were already recognized as having distinct biological needs from men, such as for reproductive health and needs that arose from their being socialized as women. The last wave of feminism is rooted in recognition of various theories and various modes of being. To be truly free from patriarchy, the recognition of intersectionality considers women's struggle from different parts of globe, such as the black or Latin woman, to the big distinct struggles that are different from women's struggles in the Western world. While the discussions of waves of feminism ends in the 1990s, it does not mean that newer waves do not exist. In addition, throughout most of Western history, women were confined to the home while men dominated public life. Women were denied the right to own property, study, or participate in public life in medieval Europe. At the end of 19th century, women in France were still required to cover their heads in public, and the husband could still seal his wife in parts of Germany. Waves of feminism. Feminism is often categorized as waves time period aimed at elevating women's status in society and giving them equal rights. The wave then falls and lapses till another wave forms. This classification helps us differentiated between movements with varied purposes and characteristics and create a broad timeline of the progressions of feminism.
First wave of feminism. Suffragette movement refers to the fight for women's right to vote in elections. This was characterized by the women's struggle for equality. Occurred from the later part of the 18th century until the first half of the 20th century. This period was when women articulated their equality with men. The development of liberal political thought by philosophers like Kant, Mill, and Rousseau, understanding the equal rights of all men. Feminist movement started during the French Revolution in the late 70s. French Revolution was a triumph for the poor and starving. Thousands of women in Paris, housewives, mothers, and workers, marched to the Paris City Hall in 1789 to demand the right to cheaper bread, a right they were deprived of under the burdened monarchy. While there was no woman-specific issue addressed during this movement, it inspired the seminal text for the Western women's movement, the Citoyennes Républicaines, revolutionaries, revolutionary Republican women citizens. They demanded that women be granted the right to vote and hold civilian and military positions like men. Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of 1879, which only focused on men and men's rights. Considered an important text in the history of human rights, this declaration, supposedly proclaiming the scope of one's freedom in the French society, had excluded women. Women still did not have the same rights as men during the French Revolution. Olympia de Gauches, French feminist, writer, and political activist who believed strongly in justice and equality for all. She responded the National Assembly's declaration by publishing in 1791 her own Declaration of Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. Mary Wollstonecraft. The Manifesto of the Gauches inspired what can be considered the keystone text of liberal feminist thought. A vindication of the rights of women in 1772, she was considered as the mother of Western and Anglo-Saxon feminists. She advocated for the uplifting of women's rights through the valuation of their work within the family. Her work highlights the need for women's education and that women are not merely objects to be married off, but are also educators and caregivers of their children. Her ideas influenced other women to press policymakers in creating woman-inclusive policies for their needs, specifically their education. Both Wollstonecraft and D. Gauges' works articulated the rights of a Western woman as a person endowed naturally and equally with human rights. These texts were written by women and demanded women's rights in a male-dominated world where women seldom have a voice or an identity separate from their husbands. While these documents show insight as to why the rights of women were denied under existing laws, Friedrich Engels, a collaborator of Karl Marx in writing the Communist Manifesto, provided a plausible reason why women were oppressed. Friedrich Engels saw the relation between women and goods as the root to women's subjugation. Engels' text, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, published in 1844, describes marriage as a process of gaining control of women. Monogamy was a creation necessary to pass on wealth to one's offspring. In non-communal societies, marriage was a way for groups with more material resources, such as the bourgeois, to keep their money within the family through intermarriage and inheritance. A woman's chastity was heavily guarded. This type of oppression guaranteed that women had no choice on matters concerning their bodies, hence, marriage became a sort of lifetime slavery. This oppression has repercussions up to the present day. Women and the anti-slavery movement. The idea that a woman is a property of her husband may explain the strong connection between women's liberation movement and the anti-slavery movement in the Western world. During the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, women delegates were even made to listen to proceedings behind curtains. Two prominent figures of the American women's movement who attended the convention were Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were moved by this insulting experience. Being behind the curtain highlighted the similarity of women's situation with that of slaves. Mott and Stanton's involvement in the advocacy against slavery paved the way for them to realize that women too were oppressed by certain social structures and laws. The active participation of women in the social issue of anti-slavery incited them to liberate themselves as well from their perceived limited social status. Women and the right to vote. Women's role in the domestic sphere meant that every day women were invisible to the public eye. Those coming from prominent mercantile or royal families, while visible, were not often given the chance to influence big decisions. These realities pushed women from Western Europe and Northern America to expand their struggle toward their own emancipation. Participants in the first wave of the women's emancipation movement fought for the right to vote, equal opportunity for employment and commerce, and the right to education. The struggle for equality was most apparent in the campaign for the right to vote, but it was accompanied by struggles for women's education, equality at work, and freedom of expression in various literary and artistic genres. Declaration of Sentiments emerged from the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in New York City in 1848. Stanton enumerated in this declaration various women's issues that eventually led to what would be known as the suffrage movement. A woman's right to vote may not seem like a large issue, yet it was controversial insofar as it was believed that women were too emotional and did not possess the proper faculties to make rational decisions. The suffrage movement was the major struggle of women, uniting the Northern American and Western European women's movement during the 19th and 20th century. When upper-class women, example, householder and college-educated, won the right to vote in the 1920s, the movement splinters into various groups like the labor movement and the right to education movement.
Second wave of feminism and women's liberation. In this space, sexuality and reproductive rights were dominant issues, and much of the movement's energy was focused on passing the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing social equality regardless of sex. The second wave of feminism was rooted in movements of liberation in the 1960s and 1970s. In the heightened feminist consciousness, it was influenced by Marxist and postmodernist critiques of society and social structures. One work that awoke numerous women across America is Betty Friedan, was an American feminist writer and activist, a leading figure in the women's movement in the United States. Her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystic, is often credited with sparking the second wave of American feminism in the 20th century. The second wave of feminism also founded on such work as Simeon de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, and Shulamit Firestone, The Dialectic of Sex. These books, published between 1949 and the 1970s, marked the spirit and ideology of the second wave of feminism because they articulated the heart of a new struggle. Simeon de Beauvoir, a French feminist best known for her work The Second Sex, explored how women were not seen as equal by men, and that the very realizations of women's existence as persons was structured to be inferior. They were reduced to an object at every turn as a wife, a daughter, a lover, and a mistress, and a war. Shulamit Firestone, in her text The Dialectic of Sex, called for a feminist revolution that could help liberate women from the inequality brought about by their biology, specifically those concerning conceptions, childbirth, and the child-rearing. Firestone believed that society must change to help address women's concerns, the limitation of their biology, specifically childcare, the right to economic independence and self-determination, their integration into all aspects of society, and their freedom in relation to their sexuality before women can be liberated. Kate Mallet's text focuses on politics as power structures in the relation of sex cultus and biological sextus, creating the fundamental link between gender socializations and the patriarchal system in the formation of women as oppressed. 185. The struggle and defined by the power and can be changed if women are able to gain power. Theoretical roots in the second wave of feminism, socialist feminism. Socialist feminism was developed after Marxist feminism to address gaps found in Marxist theories. Next is, unlike Marxist, socialist feminists believe that women are oppressed in all aspects of their lives, not only in the economic aspect. Next is, socialist feminism draws a lot of different meaning from the Marxist idea of human productivity. One's productivity is based on the sexual division of labor, which is determined by society and human nature. Next is, socialism believes that women's subjugation is rooted in the concept of having monogamy as family, in which monogamous women are confined in their homes and are discouraged to participate in productivity labor. Engels argued that women could be liberated from their oppression if they entered the productive zone with their reproductive needs taken over by the state. The second wave of women's movement was built on these Marxist and radical feminist principles, which focus on sexuality and alienation arising from one's womanhood and motherhood. Theoretical roots in the second wave of feminism is the radical feminism. The civil rights movement in the U.S. inspired another form of feminism that is grounded on structural change. Next is, this feminist perspective, known as the radical feminism, sought to ensure that women's differences from men were recognized and celebrated. Radical feminism came about as reactions to the lack of attention given to sex and sexuality in the women's struggle. Radical feminism identifies one biology as the root of cause of the oppression of women, which lies in the idea that one's ability and rule could be reduced to his or her sex. The second wave is significant as it examines not only the need for equality but also the very root of the inequality. Explained that women were oppressed because they were defined as the lesser sex by systems that shape the society and the most. Patriarchy as the root of inequality. This generation of feminists believed that women were forced into rules not because of their natural inclination, but because patriarchal system conditioned them to adopt certain rules. Patriarchy, as the radical feminists described, was maintained through the control of the public sphere by men. Perhaps this belief came about as a result of industrialization and the separation of productive and reproductive work, or the association of women with child care. Nonetheless, the subjugation of women's work in the favor of society, inasmuch as it ensured that the working force, men, and future laborers' children were cared for at home. While this relationship could be symbiotic, a woman, however, did not have any choice in the matter. It would not be in the best interest of a society in need of mass labor for a woman to be rebel just to assume public work. And the last one is the call of affirmative action. Affirmative action meant a deliberate preferential option for women in order to have equal opportunity in a certain field. Before this time, women were mostly accepted in the work that related to the care of others. The usual reason was essentialist. Women are naturally oriented toward caring for others. Thus, women were preferred for jobs such as teachers, stewardess, domestic helpers, and nurses, although their superior were mostly men.
The third wave of feminism is distinguished by a heightened awareness of overlapping categories such as race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. There was also a greater emphasis on racial issues, including the status of women in other parts of the world, global feminism. This was also the era in which a number of feminist non-governmental organizations were founded, each focusing on a specific feminist issues rather than claiming to represent general feminist ideas. During this period, many concepts were destabilized, including notions of universal womanhood, body gender sexuality, and heteronormativity. The readoption of the bare lipstick, high heels, and cleavage and broad legs posed by low-cut necklines that the first two phases of the feminist movement identified with male oppression perplexed the mothers of the earlier feminist movement. Pink Floyd expressed this new viewpoint when she stated that a push-up bra in a print can coexist. In this way, feminism tends to be a global, multicultural, and it shuns simple answer of artificial categories of identity, gender, and sexuality. Its transversal politics means that differences such as those ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, etc. are celebrated and recognized as dynamic. That's a dynamic, situational, and provisional rather. The reality is conceived not so much in terms of fixed structures and power relations, but in terms of performance within contingencies. Every feminist breaks boundaries.
Personal insight, from our standpoint, there are at least as many and possibly more young women who are identified as feminists than there ever were, and this has been consistent through the decades of the 80s, 90s, and 90s. What is also true is that there are many more young men who are identified as feminists and support the movement. For some reason, we expect that because nearly all young women in the developed capitalist world have benefited from the gains of feminism, they should identify with the movement, yet there never seemed to have been a parallel between numbers of women who are utilize gains with those who identify, although I would argue that the proportion of women who identify has been growing consistently. Here's our summary and guide question. Why do we need women's rights when human rights are sufficient? Why do we need women's rights treaties when we already have general human rights instrument? Women are denied their human rights almost everywhere in the world simply because of their gender or sex. Women's rights are human rights enshrined in the international human rights treaties and other documents, and include such rights as freedom from discrimination, right to life, freedom from torture, right to privacy, access to health, right to decent living conditions, right to safety, and many others.
That would be all, and thank you so much for listening.